In our daily lives, we often carry an unspoken assumption that life should feel comfortable, stable, and predictable. We believe that if we work hard enough, plan carefully enough, and make the right decisions, we can build a life that minimises pain and maximises happiness. But over time, reality begins to challenge this belief. No matter how much effort we put in, things do not always go the way we expect. We encounter failure when we hoped for success. We experience loss when we desired connection. We face uncertainty when we longed for clarity. And in those moments, a quiet but undeniable feeling begins to emerge. A feeling that something is not aligned with what we hoped life would be. This feeling is what we often describe as suffering. At first, it may appear as frustration, disappointment, or sadness. But if we look deeper, we begin to see that suffering is not just a temporary emotional state. It is something more fundamental. It is deeply connected to the way we experience life itself. One of the most important aspects of suffering is its relationship with desire. Every action we take, every goal we pursue, and every decision we make is driven by some form of desire. We want things to be a certain way. We want outcomes that match our expectations. We want life to follow a path that feels meaningful and rewarding. However, the reality of life does not always align with these desires. There is often a gap between what we want and what actually happens. And it is within this gap that suffering begins to take shape. When our desires are not fulfilled, we feel disappointment. When expectations collapse, we feel frustration. When reality contradicts what we hoped for, we feel pain. This pattern is not limited to specific situations. It is present in almost every aspect of life. Even when we achieve what we want, the satisfaction is often temporary. The mind quickly moves to the next desire, the next goal, the next expectation. This creates a continuous cycle where fulfillment is always followed by a new form of longing. In this cycle, true contentment becomes difficult to sustain. This is why some philosophical perspectives suggest that suffering is not an accidental part of life, but a structural one. It is not something that happens occasionally. It is something that is built into the very nature of human experience. To desire is to risk disappointment. To care is to risk loss. To live is to encounter uncertainty. These are not exceptions. They are conditions of existence. When we begin to see suffering in this way, it changes how we understand our struggles. Instead of viewing pain as something abnormal or unfair, we begin to recognize it as something inherent to life. This does not make suffering easier, but it makes it more understandable. It removes the illusion that something has gone wrong simply because we are experiencing difficulty. Another important realization is that trying to eliminate suffering completely may not be possible. In fact, the more we try to avoid it, the more we become aware of its presence. We distract ourselves with constant activity, we seek comfort in temporary pleasures, and we try to control every aspect of our life. But despite these efforts, suffering continues to appear in different forms. It may show up as stress, anxiety, dissatisfaction, or a sense of emptiness that is difficult to explain. This suggests that suffering is not something that can be removed simply by changing external conditions. It It is something that is deeply tied to our internal world, to our expectations, our beliefs, and the way we interpret our experiences. This insight can feel uncomfortable at first because it challenges the idea that happiness is something we can fully control. But it also opens the door to a deeper understanding. If suffering is connected to our desires and expectations, then perhaps the way we relate to those desires can influence how we experience life. Instead of trying to control everything around us, we can begin to observe how our minds respond to situations. We can notice the patterns of expectation, attachment, and reaction that shape our experience. Over time, this awareness can create a subtle but meaningful shift. We may still experience disappointment, but it does not overwhelm us in the same way. We may still face challenges, but we are able to navigate them with more clarity. This does not mean that suffering disappears. It means that our relationship with it begins to change. Instead of seeing it as something purely negative, we begin to see it as something that reflects our inner world, a signal that points toward what we value, what we fear, and what we expect from life. And in that recognition, a new question begins to emerge. If suffering is an unavoidable part of life, and if it is closely tied to the way we desire and interpret our experiences, then how should we respond to it? Should we continue trying to avoid it, even though that approach often fails? Or is there another way to approach suffering that allows us to understand it more deeply and perhaps even transform it into something meaningful? This question does not have a simple answer, but it opens the path to a deeper exploration. Because understanding suffering is not just about reducing pain, it is about understanding life itself. Once we begin to understand that suffering is closely tied to desire and expectation, a deeper question naturally arises. If suffering cannot be completely avoided, then what should we do with it? For most people, the instinctive response is to resist. We try to push pain away, to deny it, or to replace it with something more comfortable. We seek distractions, temporary pleasures, or constant activity in order to escape the discomfort we feel inside. And while these strategies may provide short-term relief, they rarely solve the underlying issue. In many cases, they simply delay the experience of suffering, allowing it to return later in a different form. This is why avoidance often becomes a cycle. The more we try to escape pain, the more we reinforce its presence in our lives. Because deep down, the unresolved tension remains. It does not disappear simply because we choose not to look at it. This is where a different approach becomes necessary. Instead of running away from suffering, we can begin to face it with a sense of curiosity. Not curiosity in a superficial sense, but a deeper willingness to understand what is happening within us. When we experience pain, whether it is emotional or psychological, there is always something beneath the surface. There is an expectation that was not fulfilled, a belief that was challenged, or an attachment that was disrupted. By observing these underlying elements, we begin to see that suffering is not random, it follows a pattern. And once we recognize that pattern, we gain the ability to respond differently. One of the most powerful shifts we can make is to move from asking, how do I get rid of this pain, to asking, what is this pain trying to show me? This shift may seem simple, but it transforms the entire experience. Instead of treating suffering as something meaningless, we begin to see it as something that carries information. It becomes a form of feedback, a signal that points towards something important in our inner world. For example, if we feel intense disappointment after failure, it may reveal how strongly we were attached to a specific outcome. If we feel deep sadness after losing something or someone, it reflects the value we placed on that connection. In this sense, suffering is not just something that happens to us, it is something that reveals who we are. Our values, our priorities, and our emotional investments. However, recognizing this is only the first step. The next step is to determine how we relate to that information. This is where meaning becomes essential. Because suffering without meaning often feels unbearable. It feels like pain without purpose. But when we begin to assign meaning to our experiences, something changes. The pain does not disappear, but it becomes more manageable. It becomes part of a larger narrative, a process that contributes to our growth and understanding. This idea has been explored by many thinkers who suggest that the ability to find meaning in suffering is one of the most important aspects of human resilience. When we see our struggles as part of a meaningful journey, we are more capable of enduring them. We are less likely to feel completely overwhelmed. Instead of being consumed by pain, we are able to carry it with a sense of direction. But finding meaning is not always immediate. In many cases, it requires time and reflection. When we are in the middle of a difficult experience, it can be hard to see anything beyond the pain itself. Everything feels intense, confusing, and uncertain. In those moments, it is natural to feel lost. But even then, the possibility of meaning still exists. It may not be visible right away, but it can emerge over time as we begin to process the experience more deeply. Another important aspect to consider is that meaning is not something that is given to us. It is something we create. Two people can go through similar experiences, yet interpret them in completely different ways. One may see suffering as proof that life is unfair or meaningless, while the other may see it as an opportunity for growth or transformation. The difference lies not in the event itself, but in the perspective that is applied to it. This highlights the role of interpretation in shaping our experience of suffering. While we cannot always control what happens to us, we have some influence over how we interpret those events. And that interpretation has a direct impact on how we feel and how we move forward. This does not mean that we should force ourselves to see everything in a positive light. It does not mean denying the reality of pain or pretending that difficult experiences are easy. Instead, it means allowing ourselves to fully acknowledge the pain, while also remaining open to the possibility that it may carry value. It is a balance between acceptance and exploration, between feeling and understanding. Over time, as we develop this approach, our relationship with suffering begins to shift. It no longer feels like something that completely controls us. Instead, it becomes something we can engage with more consciously. We begin to understand the connections between our expectations and our emotional responses. And with that understanding comes a greater sense of stability. We are still affected by pain, but we are not entirely defined by it. This process also leads to a deeper form of self-awareness. By examining our suffering, we gain insight into who we are and how we experience the world. We begin to see our habits of thought, our emotional tendencies, and the beliefs that shape our perception. This awareness is valuable because it allows us to make more intentional choices. Instead of reacting automatically, we can respond with greater clarity. And in that space between reaction and response, there is the potential for change. However, this journey is not linear. There will be moments where we fall back into old patterns, moments where suffering feels overwhelming and difficult to understand. But even those moments are part of the process. They remind us that growth takes time, that understanding is not something we achieve instantly, but something we develop gradually. And as we continue this process, a new perspective begins to form. A perspective where suffering is no longer seen as something purely negative, but as something that can contribute to our development. Not because it is inherently good, but because of what it allows us to see and understand. This perspective does not eliminate pain, but it changes how we relate to it. And that change can make a significant difference in how we experience life. As we move forward, the next step is to explore how this understanding can be applied in a more active way. If suffering can reveal meaning and increase awareness, then how can we use it to shape our actions, our decisions, and the way we live our lives? Once we begin to understand that suffering can carry meaning and reveal something about our inner world, the next step is to explore how we respond to it in a more active and intentional way. Because understanding alone is not enough, awareness creates the foundation, but it is our response that ultimately shapes the direction of our lives. Many people remain aware of their struggles, yet feel stuck because they do not know how to act on that awareness. They recognise the patterns, they see the connection between desire and pain, but they remain passive in the face of it. This is where a deeper shift is required. Instead of seeing ourselves as victims of our circumstances, we begin to see ourselves as participants in the process of our own growth. This does not mean that we are responsible for everything that happens to us. Life is complex and many situations are beyond our control, but it does mean that we have a role in how we respond to those situations, and that role carries a certain level of responsibility. One of the most important ideas in this context is the concept of turning suffering into strength. This does not happen automatically. It requires a conscious effort to engage with our experiences in a way that allows us to grow from them rather than be overwhelmed by them. When we face difficulty, we are presented with a choice. We can either resist the experience and remain trapped in frustration, or we can engage with it and try to extract something valuable from it. This does not mean that we should force ourselves to feel positive about negative experiences. It means that we should remain open to the possibility that something meaningful can emerge from them over time. Consider the difference between avoidance and engagement. When we avoid suffering, we temporarily reduce discomfort, but we also limit our ability to learn from the experience. We stay within our comfort zone, and as a result, we remain the same. But when we engage with suffering, we allow it to challenge us. We allow it to expose our weaknesses, our fears, and our limitations. And in doing so, we create an opportunity for growth. This process is not easy. It often involves discomfort, uncertainty, and emotional intensity. But it is within this process that transformation becomes possible. Another important aspect of responding to suffering is the idea of acceptance. Acceptance is often misunderstood as passive resignation, as if it means giving up or not caring about what happens. But true acceptance is something very different. It is the ability to acknowledge reality as it is, without unnecessary resistance. It means recognizing that certain situations cannot be changed, and that resisting them only adds more suffering. When we accept reality, we create space within ourselves. Space to think more clearly, to feel more deeply, and to respond more effectively. This does not mean that we stop taking action. It means that our actions become more grounded and less reactive. Instead of acting out of frustration or desperation, we act with a clearer sense of purpose. Acceptance allows us to conserve our energy, directing it toward what we can influence rather than what we cannot. Alongside acceptance, there is also the idea of resilience. Resilience is not about avoiding difficulty, but about developing the capacity to move through it. It is the ability to face challenges without losing our sense of direction. It is built over time through repeated exposure to difficult situations and the willingness to continue despite discomfort. Every time we face a challenge and choose to engage with it rather than avoid it, we strengthen this capacity. Over time, this creates a sense of confidence, not the confidence that life will always be easy, but the confidence that we can handle whatever arises. This type of confidence is more stable because it is not dependent on external conditions. It is rooted in our ability to respond, adapt, and learn. Another important dimension of this process is action. Understanding and acceptance are important, but they must be accompanied by action. Without action, insight remains abstract. It does not translate into real change. Action does not have to be dramatic or immediate. It can be small, consistent steps taken over time. The key is that it is intentional, that it is aligned with the understanding we have developed. For example, if we recognize that a certain pattern of behavior is contributing to our suffering, taking even a small step to change that pattern can have a significant impact over time. This is how transformation becomes practical. It moves from theory into lived experience. However, it is also important to recognize that this process is not linear. There will be setbacks. There will be moments where we fall back into old habits or feel overwhelmed by our circumstances. These moments are not failures. They are part of the process. They provide additional opportunities for learning and growth. The key is not to avoid these moments, but to approach them with the same awareness and intention that we are trying to develop. Over time, as we continue to engage with suffering in this way, our perspective begins to shift. We start to see challenges not only as obstacles, but also as opportunities. Opportunities to understand ourselves more deeply, to develop new strengths, and to refine our direction in life. This does not mean that we seek out suffering, but it does mean that we are less afraid of it. We begin to trust that even difficult experiences can contribute to our growth in meaningful ways. This shift in perspective can have a profound impact on how we live. It influences our decisions, our priorities, and the way we approach both success and failure. Instead of being driven solely by the desire to avoid discomfort, we begin to make choices that align with deeper values. Values such as growth, understanding, and authenticity. And in doing so, we begin to create a life that feels more meaningful, even if it is not always comfortable. As this perspective continues to develop, another question naturally emerges. If suffering can be engaged with, accepted, and transformed through our actions, then what does this mean for the way we define a meaningful life? Is meaning found in avoiding pain, or is it found in how we move through it? As we begin to engage with suffering more consciously, a deeper shift starts to take place in how we define meaning in life. For a long time, many of us have been guided by the assumption that a meaningful life is one that is free from pain, filled with comfort, and driven by success. We are taught to pursue happiness as the ultimate goal, to avoid discomfort whenever possible, and to measure our lives by external achievements. But when we examine this more closely, we begin to see that this definition is incomplete. Because if suffering is an unavoidable part of life, then a meaningful life cannot simply be one that avoids it. Instead, meaning must be something that exists alongside difficulty, not in its absence. This realization challenges many of our existing beliefs. It forces us to reconsider what we value, what we pursue, and what we expect from life. Instead of asking how to eliminate pain, we begin to ask how to live with it in a way that still feels purposeful. This is where a more profound understanding of meaning begins to emerge. Meaning is not something that we find only in positive experiences. It is something that can be created through the way we relate to all experiences, including the difficult ones. When we go through challenges, we are often faced with questions that we would not otherwise consider. Questions about who we are, what we stand for, and what truly matters to us. These questions can be uncomfortable, but they also have the potential to deepen our understanding of ourselves and our lives. In this sense, suffering becomes a catalyst for reflection. It slows us down, it interrupts our routines, it forces us to step back and and look at the bigger picture. Without these moments of interruption, we might continue moving forward without ever questioning our direction. We might achieve success without understanding why we are pursuing it. We might accumulate experiences without truly engaging with them. Suffering breaks that automatic flow and creates an opportunity for awareness. However, this opportunity is not always easy to recognise. When we are in the middle of a difficult experience, it is natural to focus on the pain itself. Our attention narrows, our thoughts become repetitive, we may feel trapped in a cycle of frustration or sadness. But even within this state, there is a possibility for a different perspective. If we can create even a small amount of distance from our immediate reaction, we may begin to observe the experience more objectively. We may begin to see that the situation, while painful, is also revealing something important. This does not remove the pain, but it adds another layer of understanding. Over time, as we develop this ability to reflect, our relationship with suffering continues to evolve. We begin to see that meaning is not something fixed or static. It is something that we actively create through our interpretation and our actions. Two people can face similar challenges and emerge with completely different perspectives on their lives. One may feel defeated, while the other may feel strengthened. The difference lies not in the experience itself, but in the meaning that is constructed from it. This highlights an important truth. Meaning is not determined by circumstances alone. It is shaped by the way we respond to those circumstances. This realization can be empowering because it suggests that even in difficult situations, we have the capacity to influence our experience. We may not be able to control everything that happens, but we can influence how we understand it and how we move forward. This is where responsibility and freedom intersect. On one hand, we are limited by the conditions of life. We cannot avoid uncertainty, loss, or change. On the other hand, we have the freedom to choose how we engage with those conditions. This freedom is not always easy to exercise. It requires awareness, effort, and a willingness to face discomfort. But it is also what allows us to create meaning in our lives. Another important aspect of this process is the recognition that meaning is often found in struggle rather than comfort. When everything is easy, we may feel satisfied, but that satisfaction is often temporary. It does not necessarily lead to a deeper sense of fulfillment. In contrast, when we overcome challenges, when we persist through difficulty, and when we grow through adversity, the sense of meaning that emerges is often more enduring. This is because it is connected to effort, to growth, and to a deeper understanding of ourselves. It is not given to us easily. It is something that we develop over time. This does not mean that we should seek out suffering or avoid comfort entirely. Both have their place in life, but it does suggest that we should not define meaning solely in terms of ease or pleasure. A meaningful life may include moments of happiness and moments of pain. It may include success and failure. What matters is how we integrate these experiences into a coherent sense of purpose. As we continue to reflect on this, we may begin to notice a shift in our priorities. We may become less focused on avoiding discomfort and more focused on living in alignment with our values. We may begin to ask different questions. Instead of asking, how can I make my life easier? We may ask, what kind of life is worth living, even if it is difficult? This question moves us beyond the pursuit of comfort and into the realm of purpose. It encourages us to think about what we are willing to face, what we are willing to endure, and what we are willing to commit to. And in answering these questions, we begin to shape a life that feels more meaningful, even in the presence of suffering. As this perspective continues to develop, another important question begins to take form. If meaning is something we create through our response to life, then how do we choose the values that guide that response? And how do we ensure that those values lead us toward a life that is not only bearable, but deeply fulfilling? As we begin to question what truly gives life meaning, we are inevitably led to the topic of values. Because the way we respond to suffering, the choices we make, and the direction we take in life are all shaped by what we consider important. Values act as an internal compass. They guide our decisions, influence our priorities, and determine how we interpret our experiences. Without clear values, it is easy to drift through life, reacting to situations without a deeper sense of direction. We may chase temporary comfort, follow external expectations, or pursue goals that do not truly resonate with who we are. And when difficulties arise, as they inevitably do, we may find ourselves feeling lost, unsure of how to respond or what to hold on to. This is why clarifying our values is such an essential part of navigating suffering. When we know what matters to us, we are better able to face challenges with a sense of purpose. The pain does not disappear, but it becomes connected to something meaningful. It becomes part of a larger commitment, rather than an isolated experience. However, identifying our values is not always straightforward. Many of the values we carry are shaped by external influences. Society, culture, and environment all play a role in shaping what we believe is important. From a young age, we are often taught to value success, recognition, stability, and comfort. While these things are not inherently wrong, they may not fully align with our deeper sense of meaning. This can create a conflict. We may achieve what we were told to pursue, yet still feel unfulfilled. We may reach certain milestones, yet feel that something is missing. This disconnect is often a sign that our external goals are not aligned with our internal values. And when suffering enters the picture, this misalignment becomes even more apparent. Difficult experiences tend to strip away what is superficial. They force us to confront what truly matters and what does not. In this way, suffering can act as a filter. It removes distractions and brings our attention back to what is essential. But this process requires honesty. It requires us to question whether the life we are living is truly aligned with our values or simply shaped by external expectations. This is not an easy question to answer. It can challenge our assumptions and force us to reconsider the direction we have taken. But it is also a necessary step if we want to create a life that feels meaningful. Once we begin to clarify our values, the next step is to align our actions with them. This is where the concept of commitment becomes important. Values are not just ideas, they are principles that are expressed through our actions. It is one thing to say that we value growth, honesty, or connection. It is another to act in ways that reflect those values, especially when it is difficult. This is where suffering often plays a crucial role. It tests our commitment. It challenges us to act in alignment with our values even when it is uncomfortable. For example, if we value personal growth, we may need to face situations that push us beyond our comfort zone. If we value honesty, we may need to have difficult conversations. If we value connection, we may need to remain present even when relationships become challenging. In each of these cases, discomfort is not a sign that something is wrong. It is a natural part of living according to our values. And when we are able to endure that discomfort for the sake of something meaningful, our experience of suffering begins to change. It is no longer just something we want to avoid. It becomes something we are willing to face because it serves a purpose. This shift can be subtle, but it has a powerful impact. It changes the way we interpret our experiences. Instead of seeing challenges as obstacles that prevent us from living well, we begin to see them as part of the process of living meaningfully. However, it is important to recognize that this does not eliminate struggle. Living according to our values does not make life easy. In many cases, it makes life more demanding. It requires effort, consistency, and resilience, but it also creates a deeper sense of fulfillment because our actions are no longer driven solely by the desire for comfort or approval. They are guided by something more stable and enduring. Another important aspect of this process is flexibility. While values provide direction, they are not rigid rules that must be followed without question. Life is complex, and situations often require us to adapt. There may be moments where different values come into conflict and we need to make difficult choices. In these moments, it is important to reflect carefully and consider what aligns most closely with our deeper sense of purpose. This requires awareness and judgment. It requires us to remain connected to our values while also being open to learning and growth. Over time, as we continue to reflect and act, our understanding of our values may evolve. What felt important at one stage of life may shift as we gain new experiences. This is a natural part of development. The key is to remain engaged in the process, to continue questioning, and to continue aligning our actions with what feels meaningful. As this alignment becomes stronger, our relationship with suffering continues to change. We may still experience pain, but it is no longer directionless. It becomes part of a path that we have chosen. A path that reflects who we are and what we stand for. And in that sense, even difficult experiences can contribute to a deeper sense of purpose. As we move forward, another question begins to emerge. If values guide our actions and give meaning to our struggles, then how do we maintain this alignment over time, especially in a world that constantly pulls our attention in different directions? As we begin to align our lives with our values, a new challenge gradually appears. It is not the challenge of understanding or even the challenge of choosing what matters, but the challenge of maintaining that alignment over time. Because the world we live in is constantly pulling us in different directions. There are endless distractions, expectations, and pressures that can slowly shift our focus away from what we have identified as meaningful. Even when we are clear about our values, it is easy to lose sight of them in the complexity of daily life. We become busy, overwhelmed, or emotionally reactive, and without realizing it, we begin to drift. This drift is often subtle. It does not happen all at once, but gradually through small compromises and unconscious decisions. Over time, these small shifts can create a significant distance between how we live and what we truly value. And when that distance grows, a familiar feeling begins to return, a sense of disconnection, dissatisfaction, or quiet unrest. This is often a sign that we are no longer fully aligned with ourselves. Maintaining alignment, therefore, requires more than intention. It requires awareness. It requires us to periodically pause and reflect on how we are living. To ask ourselves whether our actions still reflect what we believe is important. This kind of reflection is not always comfortable. It may reveal inconsistencies, habits, or patterns that we would rather not confront. But it is also essential. Without it, we risk continuing on a path that no longer feels meaningful, simply because it has become familiar. One of the most effective ways to maintain alignment is through conscious attention. In a world filled with constant stimulation, attention has become one of our most valuable resources. Where we direct our attention shapes our experience of life. It influences what we notice, what we prioritize, and how we respond to situations. If our attention is constantly scattered, it becomes difficult to stay connected to our values. We react impulsively, driven by immediate emotions or external pressures. But when we cultivate focused attention, we create space for intentional action. We become more aware of our choices and more capable of aligning them with what matters to us. This does not require complete control over our thoughts or emotions. It simply requires a willingness to notice them, to observe when we are being pulled away from our values, and to gently redirect ourselves. Another important aspect of maintaining alignment is discipline. Discipline is often misunderstood as rigid control or harsh self-regulation, but in this context, it is better understood as consistency. It is the ability to continue acting in accordance with our values, even when it is inconvenient or uncomfortable. This consistency builds stability over time. It creates a foundation that allows us to navigate challenges without losing our sense of direction. Discipline is not about perfection. It is about persistence. There will be moments where we fall short, where we act in ways that do not fully reflect our values. These moments are not failures, they are part of the process. What matters is our ability to return, to realign, to continue moving forward with greater awareness. Alongside discipline, there is also the role of environment. The environments we place ourselves in have a significant influence on our behaviour. They can either support our values or pull us away from them. For example, if we surround ourselves with constant noise, distraction, and superficial engagement, it becomes more difficult to maintain focus and depth. But if we create spaces that encourage reflection,
presence and intentionality, it becomes easier to stay aligned. This does not mean we need to control every aspect of our environment.
But it does suggest that we should be mindful of the influences around us. The people we interact with, the content we consume, and the habits we develop all shape our experience in subtle but powerful ways. By making conscious adjustments to these elements, we can create conditions that support our values rather than undermine them. Another key factor in maintaining alignment is patience. Change does not happen instantly. Developing a life that reflects our values is a gradual process. It involves repeated effort, reflection, and adjustment. There will be periods where progress feels slow or unclear. There may be moments of doubt where we question whether our efforts are making a difference. In these moments, patience becomes essential. It allows us to continue without immediate results. It helps us stay committed even when the outcome is uncertain. Over time, this patience contributes to a deeper form of stability. We become less dependent on quick validation and more focused on long-term growth. As we continue to practice awareness, discipline, and patience, something begins to change within us. Our actions become more consistent, our decisions become more intentional, and our sense of direction becomes clearer. We may still encounter challenges, distractions, and moments of uncertainty, but they no longer affect us in the same way. We are able to navigate them with greater stability and clarity. This does not mean that life becomes easy. It means that we become more grounded in how we move through it. And in that groundedness, our relationship with suffering continues to evolve. It becomes less about resistance and more about integration. We begin to see difficult experiences not as disruptions, but as part of the ongoing process of living according to our values. This perspective allows us to maintain a sense of meaning, even in the face of difficulty. It provides a form of continuity, a sense that our experiences are connected rather than fragmented. And as this continuity strengthens, we begin to experience a deeper form of fulfillment. Not the kind that comes from temporary comfort, but the kind that comes from living in alignment with what truly matters. As we reach this point, one final question begins to emerge. If we are able to understand suffering, create meaning from it, align our lives with our values, and maintain that alignment over time, then what does it mean to truly accept life as it is, with all its uncertainty, imperfection, and unpredictability? As we arrive at the final stage of this exploration, we are faced with one of the most profound realizations about life itself. After understanding suffering, assigning meaning to it, aligning with our values, and learning how to maintain that alignment, we begin to encounter a deeper form of acceptance. Not the kind of acceptance that comes from giving up, but the kind that comes from fully acknowledging the nature of life as it is. Life is not perfectly ordered, it is not entirely predictable, and it is not always fair. There are moments of beauty, connection, and clarity. But there are also moments of confusion, loss, and pain. These elements exist together, not separately. And to accept life is to accept this coexistence. For many of us, the desire for control is very strong. We want to shape life according to our expectations. We want outcomes that feel safe, stable, and satisfying. But the more tightly we try to control everything, the more we begin to feel the tension of uncertainty. Because life does not fully submit to our plans, there will always be variables we cannot manage, situations we cannot predict, and outcomes we cannot guarantee. This is where acceptance becomes essential. Acceptance is not about passivity, it is about clarity. It is about seeing reality without distortion, without denial, and without unnecessary resistance. When we accept the uncertainty of life, we stop fighting against what cannot be changed, and in doing so, we free up energy that was previously spent on resistance. This energy can then be directed towards something more meaningful, toward how we choose to live within the conditions that are given to us. Another important aspect of acceptance is the recognition of imperfection, both in ourselves and in the world around us. We often carry an idealized image of how things should be,
how we should behave, how others should act, and how life should unfold. But these ideals are rarely fully realised, and when reality does not match them, we experience frustration, disappointment, and sometimes even self-criticism. Acceptance allows us to soften this gap. It allows us to recognise that imperfection is not a flaw in the system, but a natural part of it. This does not mean that we stop striving for improvement. It means that we do so with a more balanced perspective. We work toward growth without rejecting the reality of where we are. This creates a healthier relationship with ourselves and with the world. We become less harsh, less reactive, and more understanding. As acceptance deepens, we also begin to experience a shift in how we relate to uncertainty. Instead of seeing it as something threatening, we begin to see it as an open space, a space where possibilities exist, a space where life can unfold in ways that we cannot fully anticipate. This perspective does not remove fear entirely, but it changes how we engage with it. Fear becomes something we can acknowledge without being controlled by it. We are able to move forward even when the outcome is unclear. And in that movement, we begin to experience a different kind of freedom. Not the freedom of having complete control, but the freedom of being able to respond to whatever arises. This is a more grounded form of freedom, one that is not dependent on external conditions, but rooted in our internal capacity to navigate life. Alongside this, there is also a growing sense of presence. When we are no longer constantly resisting reality or trying to control every outcome, we become more available to the present moment. We begin to notice things more clearly. The small details, the subtle changes, the quiet moments that often go unnoticed. This presence brings a different quality to our experience. It allows us to engage with life more fully, even in simple situations. And over time, this can lead to a deeper sense of appreciation. Not just for the positive moments, but for the experience of being alive itself. However, acceptance does not mean that suffering disappears. Pain, loss, and difficulty remain part of life, but our relationship with them continues to evolve. Instead of seeing them as interruptions, we begin to see them as part of the whole part of a larger process that includes both challenge and growth. This perspective creates a sense of continuity. Life is no longer divided into good moments and bad moments, but experienced as a connected flow, and within that flow we find a different kind of stability. Not the stability of fixed outcomes, but the stability of understanding. The understanding that whatever happens, we have the capacity to face it, to learn from it, and to integrate it into our experience. This understanding brings a quiet sense of confidence, not the confidence that everything will go according to plan, but the confidence that we can navigate whatever comes, and this confidence changes how we live. It reduces the need for constant control, it softens the fear of uncertainty, and it allows us to engage with life more openly as we reflect on this journey. We may begin to see that suffering was never just something to avoid, it was something that invited us to look deeper, to question our assumptions, to clarify our values, and to develop a more conscious way of living.
It challenged us, but it also guided us. It created difficulty, but it also revealed meaning. And in that process, it became something more than just pain. It became part of our growth, part of our understanding, and ultimately, part of our life. This does not mean that we welcome suffering, but it does mean that we no longer fear it in the same way. We recognise its place, we understand its role, and we learn how to live with it rather than constantly trying to escape it. And perhaps in that acceptance, we find something unexpected, a sense of calm that does not depend on perfect conditions, a sense of clarity that is not shaken by every challenge, and a sense of meaning that remains even in the presence of uncertainty.